On a Tuesday morning in April of 1961, a young man named Robert Hale drove his pickup truck down a dirt road in Hardin County, Iowa, and parked at the edge of a field that nobody in the county wanted to look at for too long. The field stretched out before him, 140 acres of gray-brown soil where nothing had grown properly since the early 1930s. The fence-line weeds were thin and yellow. The few wild plants that managed to push through looked stunted, wrong, like something in the ground itself was rejecting them. Even the crows avoided it. Robert had noticed that the first time he drove past. No crows. Every other field in the county had crows. This one didn't. Robert was 24 years old. He had $11,000 in savings, every dollar earned working other men's farms since he was 15. He was about to spend most of it on this field. His uncle, a farmer named Dale who had worked Hardin County ground his entire life, had driven out with him that morning. Dale stood at the fence line looking at the field with the expression of a man watching someone walk toward a fire. "You know what they call this place," Dale said. It wasn't a question. Gannetts Hollow. Robert kept looking at the field. "They call it the dead ground." Dale pulled his jacket tighter, though the morning wasn't cold. 4 families, Robert. 4 families tried to farm this since 1932. All 4 went under, lost everything. The Gannetts, the Coopers, the Whitfields, and the Marsh family. Good farmers, all of them. Hard-working people who knew what they were doing. Dale shook his head. And every single one of them ended up selling equipment at auction and moving to town with nothing. Robert nodded slowly. "I know the history." "Then why are you standing here?" Robert turned to look at his uncle. "Because nobody ever told me why. Why nothing grows. Just that it doesn't." He looked back at the field. "Don't you want to know why?" Dale stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to the truck. "Boy," he said over his shoulder, "some things just are what they are." Robert stood at that fence line alone for another few minutes, looking at the gray soil, the absent crows, the thin yellow weeds along the edge. Then he got in his truck and drove to the bank. Now let me tell you about Gannetts Hollow, because the story of the dead ground goes back further than most people knew. The original owner was a man named Frank Gannett, who had homesteaded the land in 1894. Frank had been a capable farmer, not wealthy but steady. He'd grown corn and oats on that ground for nearly 40 years without serious trouble. His neighbors respected him. His family was fed. His debts were small and paid on time. Then, sometime in the late 1920s, things began to change. The corn came up thinner each year. The oats barely filled their heads. By 1931, Frank was producing half what he'd grown a decade earlier, on the same ground with the same effort. By 1933, he was finished. The bank took the land, and Frank Gannett moved to Eldora at 71 years old and died 2 winters later. The second family, the Coopers, bought the land in 1936. They figured Frank had just been old and tired, that the land needed fresh energy and younger hands. They worked it hard for 6 years. Same result. The crops came up weak, struggled through summer, produced almost nothing at harvest. The Coopers left in 1942. The Whitfields came next. They lasted 4 years. The Marsh family after them lasted 5. By 1951, the land sat empty, owned by the county after the last bank that held the mortgage finally gave up trying to sell it. The asking price dropped year by year. By 1961, they would practically give it away. That was the history Robert Hale had read in the county recorder's office the week before he drove out to look at it. What he had also noticed, sitting in that office with the deed records spread across the table, was something that nobody seemed to have remarked on. In 30 years of failure, in 4 families losing everything on that ground, not one document mentioned a soil test. Not one record showed that anyone had sent a sample to the Extension Office or the State University lab. Not one note in any file asked the question that Robert thought was the most obvious question in the world. What is wrong with the dirt? Now let me tell you about Robert Hale, because he was not like the other farmers who had stood at that fence line. Robert had grown up on his family's 200-acre farm outside of Ackley, about 15 miles from Gannetts Hollow. He'd learned to drive a tractor at 9, taken over half the field work by the time he was 16, known the rhythms of planting and harvest the way other boys knew baseball statistics. He was a natural farmer in the old sense, instinctive, patient, attentive to weather and soil, and the small signals that a field sent to anyone willing to pay attention. But Robert had also done something that most farm boys in 1950s Iowa hadn't done. He'd read. Not farm magazines, though he read those too. Books. Soil science textbooks he ordered through the mail. Agricultural chemistry manuals from the state library. A correspondence course from Iowa State that cost him $180 and took him 3 winters to complete, working through the lessons at the kitchen table after the chores were done. His father thought it was a waste of time. You learn farming by farming, his father said more than once, not by reading books about farming. Robert never argued. He just kept reading. What the books taught him, what his father's farming by doing never had, was that soil was not simply dirt. It was chemistry, a living system of minerals and biology and delicate balances that could tip in ways that were invisible to the eye, but fatal to anything planted in it. He learned about pH, about the scale of acidity and alkalinity that determined whether nutrients in the soil were available to plant roots or locked away, chemically inaccessible, as useless as if they weren't there at all. He learned that a field could look perfectly normal, good color, good texture, reasonable depth, and be completely unable to grow crops because its chemistry was wrong. And he learned that wrong chemistry, in most cases, was fixable. That was the word that stayed with him, fixable. When he heard the story of Gannetts Hollow, he didn't hear a curse. He heard a chemistry problem that nobody had diagnosed. He signed the papers on a Wednesday morning in April of 1961. He paid $7,840 for 140 acres of dead ground. $56 an acre when good Hardin County farmland was selling for $180. The loan officer at the bank, a man named Arthur Sims, who had processed farm loans for 22 years, made Robert sign a separate document acknowledging that Arthur had advised against the purchase. Robert signed it without reading it twice. Walking out of the bank, he ran into Carl Dreesen, who ran the feed store on Main Street and had sold supplies to every farmer in the county for 15 years. Carl had heard the news before Robert reached the door. "Heard you bought the Gannett place," Carl said. Robert nodded. Carl looked at him with the careful expression of a man who didn't want to say what he was thinking. "Robert, that ground has broken 4 families. Good families. People who knew what they were doing." "I know. What makes you think you can do what they couldn't?" Robert looked at Carl steadily. "I'm going to start by asking why they couldn't." Carl opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked at Robert for a moment, then he shook his head slowly and went back inside. That afternoon, Robert drove out to Gannetts Hollow alone. He brought a shovel, a notebook, and a box of small paper bags he'd gotten from the Extension office the week before. He spent 4 hours walking every acre of that field, digging small holes at regular intervals, crumbling the soil in his fingers, smelling it, looking at its color in the afternoon light. What he found puzzled him. The soil was not sandy, not rocky. not waterlogged or compacted in any obvious way. It was Iowa loam, dark and reasonably deep, the kind of ground that should have been growing 100-bushel corn without difficulty. But it felt wrong. He couldn't have explained it to anyone who hadn't read what he'd read. It felt thin somehow, lifeless, like the biology had gone out of it, like the ground was exhausted in a way that went deeper than tired. He filled 12 sample bags from different locations across the field, labeled each one carefully in his notebook, and drove to the county extension office before it closed. The extension agent was a man named Walter Pruitt, about 10 years older than Robert, who looked up when Robert came in with his sample bags. "Soil test," Robert said. 12 samples from the Gannett place. Walter's expression changed. "You bought the Gannett place, closed on it this morning." Walter looked at the sample bags on the counter. Then he looked at Robert. "Nobody's ever brought soil from that field in here before." "I know. That's why I'm bringing it." Walter was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his face, the professional detachment of an extension agent giving way to something that looked like genuine curiosity. "I'll send these to the state lab today," he said. "Results in about 2 weeks. Costs $15. Robert paid the $15. Then he went home and waited. Those 2 weeks were the longest of his life. He drove past the field every evening on his way home, looking at it in the fading light, thinking about what the lab might find. His Uncle Dale called twice to ask if he'd come to his senses yet. His father didn't call at all, which Robert understood to mean that his father had already decided how this would end. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, 14 days after he'd dropped off the samples. Robert. It was Walter Pruitt, and his voice had something in it that Robert hadn't heard before. A particular quality of controlled excitement, the voice of a man who has found something unexpected and is trying to stay professional about it. "You need to come in." Robert was in Walter's office within the hour. Walter had the results spread across his desk, 12 sheets of paper with numbers and charts and reference ranges printed in columns. He'd marked certain numbers in red pencil. Robert sat down and looked at the papers. "Tell me what I'm looking at," Robert said. Walter pulled his chair around to Robert's side of the desk. He pointed at a column of numbers. pH readings, one from each sample location. Robert looked at the column. Every number was below 4.5. Several were at 4.2 or 4.1. "Normal agricultural soil," Walter said carefully, "runs between 6.0 and 7.0. Below 6.0 and you start losing yield. Below 5.5 and most crops struggle seriously. Below 5.0 and almost nothing grows." Robert looked at the numbers. "And below 4.5? Walter paused. Below 4.5, the soil chemistry becomes actively hostile to plant growth. Nutrients that are technically present in the soil become chemically locked. The plants can't absorb them no matter how much fertilizer you add. It's like trying to fill a bucket that has a hole in it. You can pour in all the nitrogen and phosphorus you want, but the acidity prevents the roots from taking any of it up. Robert sat very still. So the 4 families who farmed that ground were essentially farming in battery acid. Walter nodded. Not literally, but chemically the effect is similar. Nothing they did could have worked. They could have been the best farmers in the state, and the result would have been the same. The chemistry was wrong. "Is it fixable?" Robert asked it quietly. The most important question of his life, asked in the same tone he might have asked what time it was. Walter looked at him. "Yes, agricultural limestone. Lime. You spread it on the field, work it into the soil, and over 1 to 3 years it neutralizes the acidity and brings the pH back into range. Farmers use it all over the state. It's standard practice wherever soils run acidic. How much would I need? Walter did the calculation on a notepad. For 140 acres at this pH level, you're looking at roughly 500 tons to start, maybe another application the following year. At current prices, call it $1,200 total. Robert looked at the 12 red-circled pH readings on the desk. 12 data points from 12 locations across a field that had destroyed 4 farming families over 30 years. $1,200, he said, give or take, to fix a problem that's been here for 30 years. Walter was quiet for a moment. What I can tell you is that nobody ever tested it. Not once. In 30 years of failure, 4 families farming this ground, nobody ever asked the lab what was wrong. He picked up one of the result sheets and looked at it. They just assumed it was cursed, assumed it was unfixable. Never once thought to ask what was actually wrong. Robert looked at the results for a long time without speaking. Then he stood up, shook Walter Pruitt's hand, and drove to the farm supply store to ask about lime. Let me tell you about the first year, because that's when the county started paying attention. Robert spread his first application of agricultural lime across Gannetts Hollow in the fall of 1961. He rented a spreader, bought 500 tons of limestone, and worked it into the soil over 3 weeks of long days that left his shoulders aching and his hands raw. The neighbors drove past and watched without stopping. Some of them he could see shaking their heads from the road. He planted a test crop in the spring of 1962, half corn, half oats. Walter had told him the first year would show only partial improvement, that lime worked slowly, that soil chemistry didn't reverse overnight. What came up in May of 1962 was thin, unimpressive by any county standard, but it was alive, and on ground where nothing had lived properly in 30 years, alive was a different kind of word. He spread more lime that fall. The second year was better. The corn reached 5.5 feet. The yield was still below county average, but measurably above the first year. Robert could see the chemistry moving in the right direction, the way you can see a patient recovering from illness, slowly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. He spread more lime. The third year, 1964, the corn came in at 78 bushels per acre. The county average was 94. Robert was still below average, but he was no longer in a different category from average. He was simply a farmer having a modest year on ground that was still recovering. Carl Dreesen stopped him outside the feed store that October. "Heard your corn came in decent this year," Carl said. Robert nodded. "First real crop off that ground since before the war." Carl looked at him. "The limestone did it?" "The pH was wrong. Limestone fixed the pH. That's all it was." Carl was quiet for a moment. "All it was," he said slowly. "All it was." Carl shook his head. 4 families. He said it the way you say something when the weight of it is still arriving. 4 families, and nobody ever tested the ground. He looked at Robert. "We all just assumed it was cursed, assumed it was unfixable. Never once thought to ask what was actually wrong." He looked down at the sidewalk. That $15 test, that's what nobody thought to do. That's what nobody thought to do. By 1967, Gannetts Hollow was producing at 90% of county average. By 1969, It was above average. Robert planted the same ground that had broken 4 families and harvested 110 bushels of corn per acre on land that had been called dead ground for 30 years. Carl drove out to see it in July of 1969. He stood at the fence line looking at the corn and didn't say anything for a long time. 3 families I knew personally, Carl said finally. The Coopers, the Whitfields, the Marshes. Good people. George Cooper used to come into my store every week for 20 years. His whole family worked that ground. He shook his head. They never tested it. They didn't know to test it. But the knowledge was there. At the extension office, at the state lab. Walter Pruitt would have processed the sample for $15. Carl turned to look at Robert. The knowledge was available, and nobody used it. Robert looked at the corn. It was true. The information that had saved his farm, the understanding of soil pH, the knowledge that lime could correct it, the simple procedure of collecting samples and sending them to a lab, none of it was secret. None of it was new. It had been available for decades in extension pamphlets, in soil science textbooks, in the very correspondence course that Robert had taken at his own kitchen table after the chores were done. The knowledge had been there the whole time. Nobody had thought to go looking for it. Now let me tell you about the conversation that happened 20 years later, because it's the conversation that holds the whole story together. It was a Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1981. Robert was 54 years old and had been farming Gannetts Hollow for 20 years. Carl Dreesen had retired from the feed store 2 years earlier. He pulled into Robert's lane and they sat on the porch with coffee, looking out at the field that stretched away in the late afternoon light, green and full and completely ordinary, which was the most extraordinary thing about it. I've been thinking about something, Carl said. Robert waited. That $15. Carl turned his cup in his hands. I've been telling people about it for years. The $15 test that broke the 30-year curse. I used to think the remarkable thing was how cheap it was. $15 to fix something that destroyed 4 families. He paused. But I don't think that anymore. What do you think now? Carl looked at the field. I think the test wasn't really $15. I think the test was free. The knowledge to read the results, the knowledge to know what pH meant, the knowledge to understand that limestone was the answer, that knowledge existed before you ever sent in a sample. It was in the books you read, in the courses you took, in the extension office that was right there in town the whole time. Robert said nothing. He was listening carefully. The $15, Carl continued, was for someone else to do the asking, because you hadn't learned how to do it yourself yet. But once you'd learned, and you had learned from those books, from those courses, the test itself was just confirmation. The real work was done before you ever collected the samples. Carl looked at Robert. The real work was deciding to learn something that nobody around you thought was worth learning. Robert thought about that for a long time. The 4 families who went broke here, Robert said finally, they could have afforded $15. Carl nodded. Any one of them could have afforded $15. So it was never about the money. Never was. Carl set down his coffee cup. It was about whether a man was willing to admit he didn't already know the answer. Whether he could look at a problem and say, I don't know what's wrong here, and I need to find out. He paused. The 4 families, they were all experienced farmers, proud men, hard workers. They'd farmed their whole lives and they knew farming. And that knowing, that certainty, that's what kept them from asking. Robert looked at Carl. Pride's expensive that way. The most expensive thing there is, Carl said quietly. More expensive than 4 failed farms, as it turns out. He picked up his cup again. Questions are cheap, almost free, but they cost something that's harder than money to spend. They cost the admission that you don't already know. They sat in silence after that, two men on a porch looking at green corn growing in ground that a generation of farmers had called dead. Let me tell you about Robert's legacy, because the field outlasted him by a long time. Robert Hale farmed Gannetts Hollow until 2001, when he was 64 and his knees had made their final decision about climbing on and off equipment. He handed the operation to his son David, who had grown up watching his father test soil every year, adjust inputs based on results, ask questions about the ground the way other farmers asked questions about the weather. To David, this was simply farming. He had never known any other way. But he knew the history. He knew that his father had bought land for $56 an acre that everyone called dead, that a $15 soil test had revealed a fixable chemistry problem, that 4 families before his father had failed on that ground without ever asking why. He knew because his father had told him, many times, in the plain, straightforward way that Robert told everything. The county extension office put up a small display in 2005 about soil testing in Hardin County, and they used Gannetts Hollow as the centerpiece of it. Walter Pruitt, long retired but still sharp at 80, came in for the opening. He stood in front of the display looking at the photograph of the original soil test results, his own handwriting in red pencil circling the pH numbers. "I processed that sample in 1961, Walter told the small crowd. "A young man came in with 12 bags of soil from the worst ground in the county and asked me to test it. I'd worked in that office for 6 years by then. Nobody had ever brought in soil from that field. Not once." He looked at the photograph. "I always wondered about that field, drove past it 100 times, never could figure out why nothing grew there." He paused. "Never occurred to me to go ask." Robert Hale died in 2014 at the age of 77. The obituary in the Hardin County paper ran 3 paragraphs about his life and ended with one sentence that Robert would have found excessive, but that the editor felt was necessary. He was the farmer who discovered why Gannetts Hollow couldn't grow crops, and then grew crops there for 40 years. David still farms the land. His own son, Marcus, works it with him now, the 3rd generation on ground that 4 families before them couldn't hold. There's a framed copy of the original soil test results hanging in the farmhouse. Robert put it there himself sometime in the 1970s, without a label, without explanation. Just the 12 results in 2 columns, the pH numbers in red pencil, the date at the top. April 1961, Gannetts Hollow. Marcus's daughter asked him once what it was. Marcus looked at it for a moment. "That," he said, "is a $15 question that nobody thought to ask for 30 years. She looked at the paper. What happened when someone finally asked? Marcus looked at the corn outside the window, growing in ground that his great-grandfather had bought for $56 an acre because everyone in the county knew it was worthless. Everything changed, he said. That's what happened. Someone asked why, and everything changed. I'd love to know, is there something in your own life, your work, your land, that everyone around you has accepted as just the way things are? Something nobody's thought to ask why about yet? Leave it in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe. Every like, every subscription tells us these stories are worth telling. Drop your city, your state, your country below. We want to know how far this travels. Wherever you are tonight, may you find the courage to ask the question nobody else is asking. May good fortune find you. and may your family know nothing but health and happiness.